Welcome all. Welcome all. Is that a weird greeting? So glad you're here. I'm going to give just a little bit of an introduction before I introduce our guest speaker tonight. Come on in, Parkinson's. Graham, can you just look around and look for the latecomers? And instead of publicly shaming them, we'll just give them grace. Grace upon grace. So the title of what we're doing once a quarter, before we get into tonight's topic, I just want to give the general overview of what we're doing with this once a quarter event. It's called Christ and Culture. That's a phrase that comes from an author named Richard Niebuhr. And if you were at the first Christ and Culture, we kind of went through his book. But what we're trying to do as pastors is respond to, how do I say this? Respond to what's filling up our inboxes all the time. From folks who are concerned about everything that's going on in this world. And a lot of the hot topics that, the way I phrase it is, the things that are setting people's hair on fire. Just getting people all upset. What we've decided to do is treat some of these issues once a quarter, and by doing that, what we're saying is, yes, we want to talk about these things, but not from the pulpit every Sunday. Some churches have chosen to do that. They've kind of taken on the hot topics of the day from the pulpit. We're trying to keep the Bible as the chief driving narrative in the pulpit. But once a quarter, though, we thought we'd set up a forum where we can deal with these questions that are on all of our minds. How do we interact with, how do we interface with a constantly changing world, with a world that seems to be spinning out of control, with a world that seems to be moving away from some of the foundational things that we preach on Sundays? So that's why we're doing these once a quarter events. And I'm really excited about our speaker tonight, because you'll notice we're not actually taking some of those issues head on. When I mentioned my inbox a couple minutes ago, I get these questions. Pastor, why aren't you preaching about fill in the blank? And it's whatever thing, usually it's whatever thing they saw on their cable news channel of choice that day. The news cycle of the week. And then they come here and they wonder why I'm being silent about that. It might feel that way a little bit tonight too, because we're going back into history actually, to the foundation of this culture that we call the United States of America. Going back to some of the founding fathers, and not so much what they thought of politically, but how they viewed human nature almost through a spiritual lens. I don't want to steal any of your thunder, but I'm just trying to give a little framing of what we're doing tonight. Dr. Tracy McKenzie is a history professor at Wheaton College. And we actually have one of our very own members of the congregation who's one of his students, Caroline Capuano. Where's Jeff? Where's Dad? There's Jeff. And it's funny because Caroline's mom is there for Parents Weekend, so she's in Wheaton while you're here. I won't embarrass anybody, but one of Dr. McKenzie's old students from Wheaton lives nearby, so they traveled out here tonight. That shows you what a following he has as a professor. Caroline Capuano said, "It's my favorite professor." So we're in for a treat. But he does study and teach history, particularly the history of the United States. You're going to hear a lot about that tonight. And he's written this book. This will be kind of like calling people out in class, just for the fun of it. Raise your hand if you read some or all of the book. Okay, look at that, Dr. McKenzie. You've got about 20% or so. Raise your hand if you listened to the podcast interview that we did. Oh, even fewer. Okay, so there's some priming of the pump for you tonight. But for some, it'll be new. So why don't you come on up here? I'm going to pray for you before we launch in. He's going to speak for about 30 minutes, after which this microphone I'm holding, I'm going to ask him a couple follow-up questions, and then Gina Choi is going to help me run around. She's taking Pastor David's role tonight. He went down to Florida on the mission trip. He's usually the one running around with the microphone, but Gina's going to do it for us tonight. And the floor will be open to you, so think about what questions you might have for Dr. Tracy McKenzie at the end of his remarks. Come on up here and I'll lay hands on you and pray for you. Lord, we thank you for all the wisdom and insight you've given this man, your son, this servant of yours. And I love what he said, that he's written this book and is talking about this topic as a message to the church. So here we are, Lord. We're just a few members of your global church. We pray that you'd open our ears and open our hearts and open our lives for what you, by your Holy Spirit, might want to communicate to us tonight. Dr. McKenzie will be speaking, but we ask that you, the real communicator to our souls and to our intellects and to our country, I pray that you would speak to us tonight as well in ways that only you can. So come, Holy Spirit, anoint this man, anoint all of us for understanding and application. And we pray in Jesus' name, amen.
Well, good evening, everyone. It's really good to be with you. I know that anytime a public speaker starts a presentation, he's supposed to say, it's really good to be with you, right? But I want to say something in all seriousness. I've felt a burden for a long time to be able to speak to the church. If you know much about academic culture, you're really trained from graduate school on through the early years of your career that the only kind of knowledge that really matters is the knowledge that you're sharing to other academics. And that's the way that you move ahead. That's how you make a name for yourself. And I don't want to do that anymore. I think that calling is a bit of a mystery, and I don't ever want to use the word calling glibly or cheapen it, but I believe that my calling before the Lord is to remember and to remember the past and to remind the church. And so when someone gives me an opportunity to talk about things that matter, I just am so thankful. And so I'm grateful for this opportunity. I'm grateful for you. And don't feel bad if you haven't read the book. I joke and say I don't care if you read it, if you buy a lot of copies for your family. But don't worry about that. What I'd like to do tonight is to give you a little bit of sense of what I was trying to alert us to in this book that I titled We the Fallen People. I don't want our hair to catch on fire, but if I could just say a few things that might make us uncomfortable. We know that American democracy is not in a real healthy place right now. I don't know anyone who says other than that. And there are so many things going on that I think would lead to that kind of conclusion. Trust in government has really plummeted. There are various survey organizations that have been asking Americans for several decades now, do you trust government to do the right thing most of the time? And when that question was initiated in 1964, you know what proportion of respondents said that they trusted the government to do the right thing most of the time? It was 80% of respondents. Can we imagine that today? Do you know what it is now? It's about 17%. And so dramatic decline of popular trust in government. We do not trust government much anymore. We do not trust one another anymore. That's another thing I think that characterizes our world. 30 years ago, survey data suggested that about 1 out of every 5 Republicans had a very unfavorable view of Democrats. And about 1 out of every 6 Democrats had a very unfavorable view of Republicans. Those proportions have now quadrupled. And one of the statistics that I've come across that still I'm trying to wrap my mind around is this one. Did you know that in America today, interracial marriage is 2.5 times more common than the marriage of a Republican to a Democrat? We are about as divided in that sense as it's possible for us to be. So we have little trust in government, we have distrust in one another, and increasingly we are disillusioned with democracy. And there's all kinds of evidence of that. So a survey question that's often asked is, what do you think about a form of government characterized by a strong leader who does not have to bother with Congress or elections? What do you think about that form of government? What proportion of respondents say, that sounds pretty good to me? Well, it varies between 1/3 and 2/5 of respondents now. Now, what is the name for a form of government characterized by a strong leader who's not accountable to regular elections or to a Congress? It's a dictatorship. And so, at least in principle, we have a fair number of Americans saying, that might not be so bad. Beyond that, more and more Americans are saying that violence may be necessary to protect the American way of life. About 3 in 10 respondents in the last few months have said that. And they don't mean violence against external enemies, they mean violence against other Americans. If you were born before 1940, and there are a few of you in the room that would fit that bill. If you were born before 1940 and were asked, how essential is it to live under a democratic form of government, about 80% of respondents would say it's absolutely essential. We cannot imagine the good society apart from a democratic form of government. But what if you are in your 30s or younger? The proportion falls to 3 in 10. If you were born after 1980, less than a third of Americans believe that it's essential to live under a democratic form of government. There's almost only one thing that Democrats and Republicans agree about now. There was a survey done that was released just 2 months ago, and it had this statement: American democracy is in danger of collapse. 69% of Democrats agreed, 69% of Republicans agreed. It's almost the only thing, I guess, that we agree upon. American democracy is in danger of collapse. Now, I don't know if your hair's on fire yet, but here's the thing. G.K. Chesterton, who was a very prominent British Christian writer of the early 20th century, he once said that, nothing so much threatens the safety of democracy as assuming that democracy is safe. I think we no longer assume that. So there might be a blessing in that. Now, I've spent most of the last 35 years teaching on the American Civil War. And so I think a lot about the nature of democracy. I have a great burden for American democracy because one of the things I think the Civil War teaches is that there's nothing inevitable about the survival of democracy. I think it also teaches that human beings are quite capable of blundering their way into catastrophe. But I'm not here tonight to talk about my concern for American democracy. I'm here to talk about the witness of American Christians in this political moment. And so what I'd like to do is just to help us a little bit, maybe to get to a stronger place in being able to think Christianly about democracy. That adverb feels really clunky, but I like it, to think Christianly about American democracy. So I gave you a handout. The teacher in me can never go away. I have to have some sort of handout. We're not going to go through this line by line, but I thought there are some quotes here, there's some observations here that you might find worthy of your meditation later. And I am going to allude to some of those. So let's start with the question that's really hard to answer. Why do we believe in democracy to begin with? Now, it might strike you that we all have some answer for that question, but my sense is that that's not the case. Because most of us have been born into a culture where it was assumed that democracy was self-evidently defensible, self-evidently good, which meant what? That we really didn't have to think very hard about why we would stand for it. When I think of Americans today with regard to democracy, I think of this quote that I list as our present reality. If you look at the second heading there. That man, that young French aristocrat was Alexis de Tocqueville. I don't know if that's a name that you would recognize. Alexis de Tocqueville wrote a book called Democracy in America, which is, I think today, still the most important book ever written about America and the most important book ever written about democracy. And it was written by a man, I like to emphasize this to my students, who at the age of 25 said, I think the world is becoming more democratic. I need to understand this. And so he travels halfway around the world. He interviews more than 200 individuals in the United States. He thinks about what he has seen and heard for 8 years, and then he writes a 900-page reflection on what he saw. And along the way, in this very long tome, he says this. He says, a man may hold a firm belief which he has adopted without plumbing it. Plumbing mean here, it's sort of testing it, really thinking deeply about it, plumbing its depths. A man may hold a firm belief which he has adopted without plumbing it. He doubts when objections strike him. Then Tocqueville goes on to say, one may count on it that the majority of mankind will always stop short in one of these two conditions. They will either believe without knowing why, or will not know precisely what to believe. We believe something that we cannot defend, or we just don't know what to believe. Now, when I read opinion polls reports saying that a large number of American people now believe that perhaps a strong leader who's not accountable to regular elections might be a really good form of government, I think Alexis de Tocqueville was predicting what we are seeing today almost 2 centuries ago. Individuals that believed in democracy, but for reasons that they did not understand. And when democracy does not seem to deliver, doubts set in. Here's the thesis of the book, and I guess the thesis of my talk. I believe that the American people, and particularly American Christians, have embraced democracy for the wrong reason. And in embracing democracy for the wrong reason, we both contribute to the dysfunction of our political world, and we also mar the witness and testimony of the church itself. So, when I talk to my students about Tocqueville's observation, most of us know something we could not defend or don't know what to defend. I try to put on my Southern minister's voice, and I say, my brothers and sisters, this ought not to be. This is not where we should be. So our urgent aspiration, you see there, is from Paul's letter to the Corinthians, 2 Corinthians 10, 3 through 5, where he says, we demolish arguments and every pretension that sets itself up against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ. That is our glorious goal. And here is where the historian comes in to help. So yes, I'm entirely accustomed to the idea that when a historian speaks, you have to sort of defend. It's not going to be as boring as you think it's going to be. I want to argue that we cannot understand ourselves by ourselves. That stranded in the present, there is a certain kind of blindness that sets in. And when we hear Paul enjoin us to take every thought captive, here's the troubling thing. To the degree that we do not have any perspective outside of our own moment in time, we will be conforming to the world in ways that we're not even aware of. There will be thought patterns that deeply inform and influence us, that are shaping who we are, that we don't even know that we have. We cannot take thought captive. We cannot take captive thought that we're really not very self-aware of. So that ought to scare us. I want to argue that historical ignorance isn't just a sort of a lifestyle choice. It's a dangerous thing for the Christian. It's a dangerous one for the one who does not want to be shaped by the culture. And so what I want to do tonight for just a few minutes is to take us back a little over 2 centuries, and I want us to revisit the creation of the Constitution of the United States. I have a quote here, which you can read at some other point at length from C.S. Lewis, who basically says, if we want to see our world today, we need intimate knowledge of the past. And so let's do that for just a little bit. The question I want us to ask about the framers is not the question that Christians tend to ask. We get really caught up in the struggles, the conflicts with our culture. And one of the things we really want to do is to make sure that the founders of the country were on our side. The way I put it is that oftentimes when we cite the founders, it's a little like those commercials as the elections draw near, right? Where you hear this political message and then someone at the end says, I'm so-and-so and I endorse this message. We want to be able to say, we're the founding fathers and they endorse this message. It's sort of what we're wanting. That is to say, we primarily argue with one another over whether they were Christian or not. I think we need to ask a different question. We need to ask the question, what did they believe about human nature? Every political system, every economic system, every social system rests on an understanding of the human condition, whether it is explicit or not. And so asking that question is asking arguably the most foundational thing we can ask about their world view. What do they believe about human nature? And you know what? They talked about it all the time. They actually didn't talk about their personal faith very much. But it asked them what they believe about human beings, what they think motivates men and women. They have an immediate answer. And they'll write about it, and they'll talk about it, and they will defend arguing about it because they say it's the most important question to ask in framing a form of government. James Madison, who was one of those members of the Constitutional Convention, he put it this way. I think it's very eloquent. Have it in bold there. He said, "What is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature?" It's the way you approach government. He goes on to say, if men were angels, no government would be necessary. Even the formation of government is saying something in terms of our understanding of the human condition. George Washington, who's going to be the chair of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia, will write a correspondence short before he leaves Mount Vernon to head to Philadelphia. And he says, if we want this undertaking to succeed, we must take human nature as we find it. And so what I've given you in the outline, we won't go through these line by line, but I've just given you a sampling of what prominent representatives at the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention are saying out loud that they believe about human motivation. If you scan that, I tried to give you a little heads up or leg up by putting in bold key words, but look at the bolded words. What are these individuals saying over and over and over again? They're saying that human beings are largely self-interested. We're selfish. We have self-love, as one of them points out. Now, let's be very clear. The framers of the Constitution didn't say that men and women are evil. They didn't say that the thoughts of our hearts are only evil and only evil that continually. They thought that men and women were capable of great acts of courage and compassion and generosity. They never for a moment, though, thought that that was natural. They never for a moment thought that that was the default. The default is self-interest. They didn't use the language typically of Scripture. They didn't quote biblical verses. They didn't cite theologians. But when Martin Luther, for example, said that all of human nature is curved in on itself, pretty much everything we do is self-referential. Everything we do in some way is advancing our own interests. When Luther said that, the framers would have said, yeah, that's true. And so they had to construct the Constitution with this self-love in mind. Because they didn't then sort of write a user's manual for the Constitution, and all we have is that final document, we don't always see that understanding of human nature. It's not always palpable to us. But let me just tell you, there is not an aspect of the Constitution, there's not an article, there's not a section, there's not a line that does not in some way build on the axiomatic belief that men and women are basically self-interested, even selfish. That is their understanding. Now, telescope forward 2 generations to what historians refer to as Jacksonian America. Now, I don't know if that's a term that you would know. You've heard of it maybe. It gets the name from Andrew Jackson, who was the individual elected president in 1828. And his presidency sort of inaugurates this era that's usually referred to the Jacksonian age, and it continues on up to the eve of the Civil War. But let's just put it this way. Jackson is going to be inaugurated 40 years after the Constitution is ratified. What are Americans thinking about human nature by the time of his presidency? Well, I've given you a lot of examples, and let me just point out a couple of things about them. We'll start with this man, John O'Sullivan. John O'Sullivan was a prominent journalist, editor of arguably the most widely circulated magazine of his day. A man who coined and popularized the term manifest destiny. I don't know if you ever heard that phrase, but it's very influential. And he's writing in an editorial about the American creed. And he says it's a cheerful creed. And he contrasts it to others that imply a distrust of mankind. And he says that any worldview that doubts the essential goodness of human beings is gloomy, degrading, and absurd. George Bancroft I threw in there because he's a historian. He's arguably really the first professional historian in the United States, but he moonlighted as a speechwriter for Andrew Jackson, actually. And Bancroft says that the common judgment, meaning the majority position, in politics and religion is the highest authority on earth and the nearest possible to an infallible decision. The Spirit of God breathes through the combined intelligence of the people. Or another way to put it, which he actually would say at certain times, is that the voice of the people is the voice of God. Herman Melville, if you still have sort of flashbacks or panic attacks, having been forced to read his work, like Moby Dick, in one of his novels, very last paragraph, very last page of the novel White Jacket, he has the protagonist say, and you can imagine that Melville is now speaking to the country through this character. Long enough have we been skeptics with regard to ourselves and doubted whether indeed the political Messiah had come, but he has come. What are the next two words? In us. When I was a teenager, I have these memories of my mother. Occasionally, we'd be in a rather heated conversation, and my mother would just step over a couple of steps away from me. And I would look at her quizzically, and she said, well, so when the lightning strikes, I will be out of the way. I guess I was saying something rather dogmatic. And I always think about the Messiah has come in us. And I want to just step aside from that. And yet that has become a truism in the culture. And you hear people applauding. Yes, yes. None more than Andrew Jackson. So when George Washington steps down from the presidency in 1796, in his address to the American people, he reminds them of, quote, the love of power and proneness to abuse it, which predominates in the human heart. Can you imagine a president today, as he's leaving office, saying, I just want to remind everyone how fallen all of us are and how selfish and messed up we all are? Compare what Washington said to what Jackson says. I have great confidence in the virtue of a great majority of the people. Virtue is defined as self-denial for the common good. I have great confidence that people naturally deny themselves to serve others, Jackson is saying. The people are enlightened, patriotic, marked by good sense and practical judgment, distinguished for their intelligence and their high tone of moral character. They are uncorrupted and incorruptible. That's pretty high praise. I call this a Hallmark movie, understanding of human nature. If you know a good Hallmark plot, right? Typically, the young, attractive person who's struggling over a decision between that suitor and some wise older person, right, will come up and say, sweetheart, what is your heart telling you, right? Follow your heart and you can never go wrong. Andrew Jackson coined that idea long before the Hallmark folks. Now, I call this the great reversal. And when we just juxtapose them side by side, it's very obvious. But we're not inclined to see it unless we go back in time. Because for 200 years, the American people have accepted what Andrew Jackson told them about human nature. It has been such a constant in our lives that we don't even notice it when we hear it. There are survey data year after year after year from multiple organizations that say, respond to this statement. Men and women are basically good by nature. Or men and women are basically born innocent. And what proportion of the American people say yes tends to be around 3/4 of respondents. And the others aren't sure how to answer, right? So a vast majority of Americans now would say we're basically good. Which basically, if I could just briefly digress and say, makes me sort of wonder what the gospel is. What is the gospel to a people that think that they're pretty good already, right? So this is what I call the great reversal. And it leads to what I also would then label a startling realization. The startling realization, here I'm quoting from C.S. Lewis, is that there are two opposite reasons for being a Democrat. What he means, he's not talking about a party here, right? He means favoring majority rule. Two opposite reasons. I'll paraphrase this for you. He's going to say, on the one hand, you may think that men and women are basically so good and so wise that not only does everyone deserve a voice, but the general welfare suffers if everyone's voice isn't heard. That would be a basis for favoring majority rule. He said another basis for majority rule is believing that we are so selfish. He actually used the word so wicked, that no one individual can be trusted with power over the rest. No small group can be trusted with power over the rest. That because we are so selfish, it's better to distribute power as broadly as possible. What we see here in Lewis's observation, I think, can be broken down to sort of three main points. Our support of democracy will always rest on a view of human nature. There are basically only two alternatives, and only one of them can possibly be correct because they're contradictory. My thesis, I told you at the outset, Americans have embraced democracy for the wrong reason. We've embraced democracy for what Lewis called the false romantic foundation of democracy. We are so good naturally, we are so wise naturally that the majority must rule. I think the framers held in tension something very, very different. They said any society where the majority does not rule is not a free society, not truly. So on the one hand, they said the hallmark, the litmus test of self-government is that the majority rules. And on the other hand, they said simultaneously, because of our nature, the majority will not always be just. That is a complicated worldview. It's in tension, those two things. And it's far easier for us simply to eliminate that tension and say people are always good and their decisions are reliably just. That wasn't the framers' understanding. So what do we do with all this? Well, I think as Christ followers, we turn to Scripture. And I'm not going to speak authoritatively to this. I'm going to let your pastor do that. I will say that C.S. Lewis said that the foundation of democracy that says they were all so good, he called that a romantic false understanding. And the foundation for democracy says it's because we're fallen that we must embrace democracy. He called the only true ground upon which democracy could flourish. I want to suggest that what the framers offered to us is a complex understanding that pitted simultaneously both a keen appreciation of human selfishness and a keen appreciation of human preciousness. Again, they did not use theological terms, but we would call this imago Dei, the idea that men and women are created in the image of God, that we have faculties that separate us from all of the rest of the created order. We have reason, we have a capacity for moral behavior and moral accountability that separates us from the rest of creation. C.S. Lewis, I think, captured this preciousness. The same person who said founding democracy on a belief in human goodness is a false, bad foundation is the person who also said there are no ordinary people. There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilizations, these are mortal, and their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit. So where does this all leave us? I think when we go back in time, one of the things that we become aware of is that we have lived now in a culture that for at least 2 centuries has taken for granted the essential goodness of humanity, even as we are less and less willing to describe our neighbors as created in the image of God. That's such a fundamental paradox, I think, to me at least. When I listen to American political rhetoric today, I don't care if it's from the left or from the right. I don't really care if it's from Christians or secular voices. What I hear is a culture that no longer takes what theologians would call original sin, a sin nature, no longer takes that seriously. Nor do we take seriously the idea of imago Dei. Because if we did, we would not describe those who disagree with us as enemies. We would not characterize every election as an existential crisis, because unless one side wins, evil will triumph. Here's one way to think about it. I think by and large, we deny original sin in ourselves and we deny the image of God in those who disagree with us. Now, what we're asked to do is hard. To hold both a keen appreciation of our fallenness and a sense of our preciousness simultaneously. But let me tell you the way I think we can do that perhaps a little more readily. To do that, I want to say just a word about what political elections often involve. And I'm not going to be specific. I'm not trying to point anyone to some sort of partisan conclusion. Political campaigns are all about story. Start listening to the ads. You will hear you're being given a story in which to situate your lives. We all tell a story about ourselves. We have to. We inhabit story. And that story that we hear from political commercials, for example, tells us who you are. It tells us a threat to you, almost always. Listen, there is a threat, and it tells you where your hope lies. Now, let me ask you, any story that tells you your essential identity, the greatest threat to your well-being, and the greatest hope for your future is a religious message. I don't care who's giving it, is a religious message. So we are bombarded with religious messages all the time. Here's the question I want you to ask. That's sort of the fundamental way to assess these. Where does this story draw the line between good and evil? Let me tell you why I pose this question. The writer Alexander Solzhenitsyn spent 8 years in a Soviet labor camp at the end of World War II. He was overheard. He was in the Russian army. He was overheard saying negative things about the dictator Joseph Stalin, and he was carted off to prison. He was first very bitter and very angry and particularly resentful of the sadistic guards that were watching over him until God gave him a kind of revelation. And that revelation was he began to imagine that in the guard's shoes, Alexander Solzhenitsyn said, I could be just as cruel, just as sadistic as that man. And this is what he reflected. He said, gradually it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either. But where? Right through every human heart. So listen to our political stories. We have these 3 more intolerable weeks of listening to these messages before Election Day. Ask the question, where are they drawing the line between good and evil? And I think you will find it is almost always a line that separates us from them. Us from them. If you ever hear a politician who says the line between good and evil runs right within my heart, I'd be inclined to sort of chase after that fella and give him or her your vote. But I don't think you're going to hear it. So here is the word of warning. We are bombarded with stories constantly. Democracy is not just a set of institutions. It's a set of values. It's a set of ways of looking at the world and thinking about ourselves and others. And the stories that we hear almost constantly are stories that I'm convinced are reflecting and shaping our hearts. And they're absolutely at war with what for centuries the church has taught about our own sin nature and about the preciousness of God's creation. I don't know what that means when you go into the voting booth. The most common criticism I've had of my book is from individuals who say, man, I agreed with everything you said, but I still don't know who you want me to vote for. What am I supposed to do on Election Day? And that's not the point. Our point is to be faithful witnesses, and I don't know what that means, but I have to believe it means, among other things, standing with Alexander Solzhenitsyn, that the line runs within my heart, separating good and evil, which means that we all need desperately the grace of God, and not just the individuals who vote our way. My longing then is not that we would become a powerful political force in our culture, but that would be faithful witnesses to the truth of the gospel. And the political consequences of that will be whatever it pleases the Lord to bring. That maybe ought not to be our primary concern. So I don't know if that caused people's hair to explode, but I hope I've given you at least something to think about.
Thank you. So I'm going to start with a question, then I'll open it up to the floor. And it's an observation and a question. The observation, it's interesting sitting where I'm sitting right now, hearing you talk about this, because visually, to me, you're standing right in front of the altar table, where we come every single week, and you're under the cross. We come every single week after praying a prayer of confession, you know, that says, I have sinned against you in thought, word, and deed, by what I've done, what I've left undone. I've not loved you with my whole heart, or my neighbor as myself. And there's this weekly ritual that Christians go through, at least at those churches where communion happens every Sunday, which it does here, where we actually make agreement with what you're saying the founders knew, which is that we are just as susceptible to evil as anyone else. In fact, just this past week, since I was here last, I have sinned and I need to confess to you. I'm not the Messiah, but you are, and you can give me your grace and kindness and forgiveness. I'm convinced that if every American went through confession and then the receiving of forgiveness every Sunday, it might correct some of this error that you've just described that we've gotten into. So the question then is, how do you see the role of Christian ritual or religious observance like I've just described and other things? Another argument could be made for coffee hour. One of the great tragedies of COVID was not just that we stopped going to church, but we stopped rubbing elbows with people in conversation in coffee hour. But if your book is a word to the church, how might you encourage us to think about those rituals and our faith as actually something that might change culture?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the idea is that these rituals are supposed to teach us, that they're supposed to be a different way of embodying a scriptural truth. You know, if I were to give takeaways, I was thinking about this before I came over here today. A lot of the takeaways I have, the action items, aren't the sort of things that we want to hear. We want to hear political strategies for effective sort of engagement with the culture. But I think our faithfulness begins in our inner lives, and our political activity must sort of grow out from that. And it seems to me that the kinds of rituals that you're talking about are ways to remake the internal furniture of our hearts. And if I had an action item for this group or for any other audience I would speak to, I would say, first of all, pray that God would show you your sin more before. And no one wants that to be the first step toward our political involvement, but that we would feel the weight of original sin. You know, the Puritans, people who lived in this part of the world 4 centuries ago, we think that they were just utterly obsessed with their sin. And you can be too preoccupied, I guess, in an unhealthy way, but in the best, that understanding of our fallenness leads to a deeper appreciation of God's grace. And if you begin to see yourself as deeply a recipient of grace, it's really hard to say of that person or whoever it is that is your enemy, that in some sense you're superior to them, that in some sense they need grace more than you do. So I think weekly confession. My only problem is I've been in too many churches that they just don't give you long enough to confess. They say, well, now we'll have silent confession, and 15 seconds later, here's a hymn, and I'm just getting started, So.
That's great. That was obviously a leading question of encouraging people to come to communion every Sunday. Gina, can you come grab the mic? And just real quick word, it is important that you do use the microphone because this is being recorded. This happens every time. People are like, my voice is loud enough. You do need to speak into the mic, and Gina's going to run around with it.
Questions?
I think it's remarkable that in 40 years, the leaders of this country reversed their thinking on human nature. And in the 1828, you have Jackson with this thought, and was it pervasive, and did it keep going right up to the 20th century when we had the scientific revolution and people are getting better and better and smarter, and we're better every day? I mean, it never went back to the original.
The short answer would be no. I don't think it ever goes back. Now, that's not to deny that there could be some fluctuations, some mild kinds of variations. But I really believe that this is a a line that the country crossed a long time ago. And we look at American democracy today and we compare it with Jacksonian democracy, and we know that there are huge differences. Women aren't voting in the 1830s. No person of color is going to vote in the 1830s. And we're just struck by how different that is. But when it comes to their understanding of human nature, Jacksonian America is 21st century America. I really don't think there has been a dramatic movement away from this major trend.
As a former academic, first of all, let me tell you how much I appreciated your book.
Thank you.
The richness of material and the use of your sources and the way you meld them together into a narrative is absolutely astonishing. So as an academic, I appreciate that. As a former editor, I also appreciate the way the book is put together. And I really mean that from the depth of my heart.
Thank you.
I'm ready to raise some, perhaps address the elephant in the room. May I? You write in your book that we should avoid every opportunity to meld our religion with any particular political party. Could you talk about that?
Not specifically. How's that? It's a great question, and as you say, it's one that probably is on the minds of many individuals. Let me just say, also, I so admire what your pastor is trying to do here, which is not to create a congregation that simply reacts to the most immediate challenge, but is able to build a very strong foundation of Christian truth that then begins to shape the way that we think and engage and respond to the world. Jesus' parable about the wise man who builds his house on a rock comes immediately to mind. I hear that that's a lot of what your pastor is wanting to do. Christian nationalism, if I could just say, it ought to be of concern to every believer. It is a form of misplaced worship that merges the nation with the church. It is a temptation that I think is perennial. It's not just something that cropped up in the last few years. And it's understandable in one sense. We all have multiple forms of identity. So we think in terms of our racial identity, our gender, the part of the world that we come from, our class, and we think of our faith. And C.S. Lewis once said, I know I quote him a lot, but in the Screwtape Letters, he says they were all drawn to what he called Christianity and then an ellipsis. Fill in the blank. Christianity and something else. And anytime your Christianity is linked to that something else, the devil is, in the Screwtape Letters, is rejoicing because he says, we've got our man. Once you link Christianity to something else, the ease with which you switch the two in order of priority is just head spinning. And so if nothing else, appreciation of our own fallenness should lead us to be really, really wary of any kind of affiliation between our faith and other kinds of human identities. So I won't go any farther than that except just to say it's a real danger.
Thank you for coming to speak. My question concerns like on an international foreign policy kind of thing. So the West, compared to the rest of the world, I would say, is very self-critical. We navel gaze. So my question for you is, how do we balance like the fact that we examine ourselves and the virtue is bad, right? How do we balance that with our moral authority? You know, World War II, helping South Korea, you get the idea. So in order to coalesce enough energy to challenge what we feel is evil, you see what I'm saying? So my concern is you know, do you get my question? I think that's enough said.
So I'm not certain I do, but I think I do. And let me just try to speak it back to you and you tell me. So I hear you saying, when it comes, for example, to important, weighty conflict beyond the borders of our country, how do we marshal, use the term moral authority for a conflict while also being very sensitive to our own problems? Maybe or maybe not.
Yes, because my perception is our enemies, foreign enemies, are not doing that.
Fair enough. So, great question, a fantastic question. How to give a short, we could have a wonderful, I think, long conversation about this. I think that what Christians are called to, in most, I don't want to say in most, in many instances of Christian life, is just impossible. But we're called to it. And I often get excited when I encounter something that seems impossible because I'm more inclined to believe that God must be leading me there because he doesn't want us to be able to do something on our own power. And here's what I mean. We have to be able to make moral distinctions. God calls us to be discerning, which means we have to say sometimes that's bad, this is good, or this is better and that's not so good. We have to be able to make discernments when it comes to foreign policy. You have to be able to make an argument that a war is just, right? And yet, I will say this, war often elicits awful theology. I just have to tell you that. And I teach a lot on the Civil War, and I joke, you never saw a Civil War commander draw his sword, put his hat on the end of the sword, say, follow me into the jaws of death. We are relatively more moral than they are. That's not how we motivate people, right? But that should be a reminder of our fallenness. When we sort of acknowledge the reality that the best way to motivate people to sacrifice is to tell them something that's not true about themselves. That ought to show us alarm. Now, I have to stop and say my father served in World War II and was on a destroyer that was sunk in the Battle of Leyte Gulf. My grandfather was in the Army in World War I. My son was in Afghanistan in the Marine Corps. And so I don't want you to hear anything that I'm saying is not thankful for my country, but for Christians, other than our Lord, all human institutions, all human communities are fallen, which means that they are always showing the mark of the fall. They're always corrupted to some degree by sin. So our distinctions are always relative, better than, worse than, not absolutes. If they are absolute, then we're saying Solzhenitsyn isn't right, that the line between good and evil doesn't run within any individual heart. It can separate nations or separate other warring peoples. It's super complicated. And if I could just sort of share my personal thought, as long as our goal, and this is easy to say and hard to live, but as long as our goal is to try to follow Christ faithfully and witness to him truthfully, and we say to ourselves, whether that leads to political victory or not is not the highest good. Whether that leads to national survival or not is not the highest good. I think we are freer to try to pursue God in truth than the moment that we start saying, but we're also concerned, we're also responsible for the outcome. Because in politics, it will lead to, but if we say this about ourselves, what will happen to the voter turnout? Maybe this would be serving the cause of the other side. The moment we think about results, the temptation for compromise becomes powerful. God raises up nations, and he calls nations to fall. He says to his church, follow me. And I know that's easy to say and hard to live, but that's what I'm thinking.
Hi, Dr. McKenzie. Thank you for being here. I am a student of history was a government major in college and very familiar with most of these texts. I'm also a new Christian, and while I didn't have a chance to read the book, I did listen to the podcast you did, and I can't wait to read the book. But there was a couple things that really struck me in your talk tonight. And I'm just looking at the first quote from de Tocqueville. And, you know, I'm one of those people that believed without knowing why in this idea of democracy. I'm very familiar with the Founding Fathers, Federalist Papers, you know, all that good stuff. But what I didn't think of was this idea of a fallen man. You know, I understood the concepts of human nature that went into writing the documents. But being a new Christian, I look at it differently. And personally, that one statistic you read about, you know, what do you think about a form of government where, you know, the leader's not accountable basically to anything? And I think you said 20%. Well, you know, that scares the daylights out of me. So I think to myself, you know, why do I believe in democracy? And I want to thank you, by the way. I was not familiar with that C.S. Lewis quote, but, you know, the fallen part of it, where, you know, you may believe fallen men to be so wicked that not one of them can be trusted with any responsible power over his fellows. That definitely was an enlightening statement. But just finally, you know, the talk that you made about the messages that we hear in political, the stories, and the enemy, if you're not for us, you're evil. During the podcast, you said something which really struck me. And what it was is you said, Christ-infused thought never promotes arrogance. And I think there's just a lot of arrogance on both sides of the debate. And I just invite all of us to, you know, all of us Christians to think of that. And, you know, we are really divided, but are we really as divided as we think we are? Because we're just not listening to each other. So with that, I pass.
Hi, thanks. I'm just curious, what I heard you say is that, what I heard you say is that democracy without the correct understanding of human nature is still a super flawed government. So is it, I mean, what's better, like a dictatorship or democracy without understanding the human nature?
I can't answer that question authoritatively because there's too many historical variables. One of the things that Alexis Tocqueville would say is that democracy can become dictatorship, that a majority can oppress a minority unjustly just as well as a single individual can oppress an entire nation. So I would hope that that's not our only two options. I mean, I want to argue, and I didn't emphasize this tonight because my focus was more on the witness of the church. But if you just want to make American democracy more healthy, if you're not thinking about the testimony of the church, I still think you want to move away from the rhetoric that we have today that denies the sinfulness of our hearts and the preciousness of our opponents. And I see that in a variety of ways. First of all, if our legislature or legislative branch is often paralyzed, in part, our worldview now says that bipartisan cooperation is moral failure. Because if the other side is evil and we're good, what does it mean to, let's join hands with the evil, you know, let's enter into a pact with Satan and we'll see what we can get done. So this worldview inhibits bipartisan cooperation. This worldview makes every election a potential source of great political instability. If you really think the other side is evil, what happens when they win? It may be the end of the United States as we know it. It may be the last, you've heard all this rhetoric, it may be the last election that flows logically from a worldview that says the line between good and evil is separating those folks from us. And if you lose an election to evil incarnate, I think you're going to be less likely to accept the results of that election. And then just finally, I think that's part of what makes us more susceptible to authoritarianism. If we believe that we're good and they're bad, but if we're good, what would be so bad about having a powerful leader run the government as long as that leader was one of us? He would be or she would be good too, presumably. So where's the risk? So I actually think there's a lot of political implications to this as well as the implications for the church. So I would hope that the alternative that we would move toward is democracy, not dictatorship, but democracy that is grounded in a skepticism of human nature based in an appreciation of our sin.
You've used the word, you've opened the ism box. So you've used the word nationalism, authoritarianism. I'm not going to ask you to define all of those, but I think if you don't put those in context, you risk doing exactly what de Tocqueville said, which is leading people to believe something that they're not sure why they believe it, because their understanding of that word's been shaped perhaps incorrectly by narratives that are not truth. So, and I'm going to use that to make a bigger point, which is there's a lot of isms, right? And Christians have co-opted, or I should say politicians and leaders have co-opted a lot of parts of Christianity to promote that ism, whether it's socialism or consumerism that we see now, authoritarianism, nationalism. You mentioned those. So my concern and my question is really about how does the church handle sort of itself, and in the way that Christian leaders and churches that I see in society now have almost promoted an alternative version of the gospel, because now they're worshiping a movement or an ideology that, and sometimes cloaked in very good words, right? Moral words like justice and other things that have a biblical meaning, and in some ways have led people away from this understanding of the sin you mentioned in the human heart and the need for Christ as Savior alone. And I just think you see a lot of churches and a lot of leaders now worshiping these isms and promoting some version of morality that is not necessarily based truly and solely on the gospel, or their church has become about something other than the gospel because of their emphasis on consumerism and self-improvement and so forth. And that to me is a particularly hard question, because it's internal to what we consider the church in America. And so how do we as Christians in a church interacting with others who would call themselves Christian or who worship, but have sort of been led, because I see this in my own friendships, have led to focus more on these isms and these other alternative somewhat messages in the gospel, but that are not the gospel, and don't recognize their own sin. And then therefore they've come to sort of worship these other attitudes and behaviors. And I'm just curious at how you would say, how do we address that? Yeah. That's tough, especially from people who are churchgoers, right?
Yeah. Can I say I don't have an answer? I mean, you've put your finger on part of the crisis within the church, a kind of deep fragmentation within the church, in which political identity is increasingly the line that separates. There was a time, and I'm not saying that this was healthy, but opinion surveys would have shown that if you're a parent and your grown daughter is being courted by a man and you're Protestant and he's Catholic, you're really troubled by that. Today, we couldn't care less. But if I'm one party and my daughter wants to marry the other party, it's horrific to us. So you're putting your finger on something. I don't know the answer. Social scientists look a lot at what causes polarization, and what they say is that there's a name for this rule, and I forget the axiom, but when communities come together like a congregation, to the degree that they are homogeneous, at the end, every individual in that community is becoming more extreme. So if it's a conservative organization, they come out more conservative. If it's a liberal, they come out more liberal. The idea is that when we confront intelligent, substantive arguments with which we disagree, it has a moderating influence on us. When we live in very homogeneous communities, it actually radicalizes us in one extreme or the other. And I think what we're seeing is that such an extreme fragmentation of America, which I think begins with the fragmentation of knowledge. I always tell my students, you know, I grew up with 3 networks on television, right? And in our world today, there's no niche too specific that you can't discover your community that will all think exactly like you. And I think a lot of the polarization that we encounter is based on that. If I could share one book recommendation for those of you who perhaps have relationships that have been strained by sort of our polarized moment. There's a book by a woman named Bonnie Christian, spelled with a K, K-R-I-S-T-I-N, that just came out last month called Untrustworthy. And it really, she writes with a pastoral kind of heart about how to nurture relationships that have been fractured by all the ways that Americans divide these days.
I'm going to give us a 1-minute break for those of you who have children and youth that were expecting to be retrieved a few minutes ago. You can leave, if anyone wants to stick around for just a few more minutes though, and we can ask more questions of Dr. McKenzie, but I do think that the children's wing is probably wondering where mommies and daddies are. So those of you who have kids, thanks Alicia, you can go retrieve those kids, and the teenagers are at my house, they're fine. They usually go late anyway, so you don't have to go run and get them. But if anybody wants to stick around, would you mind sticking around a couple more minutes?
I'd be delighted to, sure.
Maybe like 2 more questions. I wanted to give one quick response to Matt Driscoll. Matt Driscoll. Never mind, he's not listening, so we'll move on. Yes, Eric Cantman.
Yeah, earlier in the summer, I wrote a book by Andrew Klavan. I don't know if you know who he is. Jewish background, novelist, and he became a Christian. And this really ties into what you're teaching here, I think. Instead of going into his personal story of how I became a Christian and what it means to me, he's an authentic Christian. I mean, he believes that in original sin that may have come from his Jewish background. But anyway, so I read his book. It was called Truth and Beauty, or Beauty and Truth, but it's from the Keats poem. And what I found so fascinating is he really focused on the second revolution of the 18th century, which was the French Revolution. And he talked so much about the hope that was pushed on that by all the romantic poets of Wordsworth and all of them, Mary Shelley and all of these amazing people. But in point of fact, that revolution was a counterpoint to the revolution that brought us the Constitution. And it almost was stealing some of the ideas, but then putting them totally in human, non-spiritual kind of package. And that, the reason I bring that up at all is I'm saying maybe teaching people in your position should teach the components of the American Revolution and the French Revolution, because we're dealing with that problem right here in the United States of America today. Elements of the French Revolution have, over a period of that century and more, and maybe starting with Jackson, has infiltrated into the intellectual kind of construct of who America is and who the people in America are, because what came out of that, the isms that Matt was talking about, what came out of that was an inauthentic understanding of human nature, that human nature gets better, that life is progressive in nature, not politically correct, but we get better. And anybody that's lived any amount of time knows that life is more like that, and who knows what the conclusion is. But I think that counterpoint of those two revolutions explains a lot about the conflicts we're living with today in the United States, because when they started out building the Constitution after the revolution, They didn't have that yet. They were in the Enlightenment, but it was only gaining a foothold. But it really invaded our country in the 20th century, and that's what we're dealing with, it seems to me, to a certain extent. And you, as a historian, tell me about it.
I appreciate the distinction. It's an important distinction. I mainly push back in thinking that a fair amount of our error is homegrown also. I mean, not just important, but I take your point really well. I was going to say concerned as much as anything at the way in which the church is often led in these troubling patterns.
One final question.
Hi, thank you very much for coming. Really enjoyed it. And maybe this is going too much toward that political strategy, but as you said earlier, no politician could talk about the solution that you're suggesting. That really can only be in America. That's really only a Christian belief today. Yet Christianity is not within the U.S. hasn't been growing. So what does the church need to do for that to become the answer in society?
I'm only smiling because I feel embarrassed and self-conscious. You keep asking me questions that I don't have answers for. Feel inadequate. I just, I come back. This is taken out of context, but I still come back to Christ by the Sea of Galilee after the resurrection, and Peter and John in there, and Peter asks about John, what about this disciple? Because Jesus has just told him, basically, you're going to die a horrific death at some point. But what about him? And Jesus comes back and says, why are you asking about him? Follow me. Just your job is to follow me. And I don't have any of these answers. I don't know a strategy for revival. And I'm not sure if that's the right question to, and I don't mean any disrespect, but I'm not sure even that's the first question to ask. So God is saying to us, follow him. And it's not that we all do that individually. We do that as bodies of believers. But thinking about how to get results, I suspect, is a little bit of a snare to us.
It's a good note to end on with Jesus on the beach after the resurrection. We'll end with that image. Thank you, everybody, for really engaging with this subject with Dr. McKenzie and your church. I hope this will generate many more conversations for you in your households and in your workplaces and in our church. We will have another Christ and Culture event in January. We're still designing what that one is going to be about, what it will look like, so stay tuned for more information. Also, for those of you who are parents or who have kids in your lives, we're going to do, actually, it's not a parenting one, it's going to be one on marriage. Also in January, we'll be doing Friday nights like this with our kids coming, follow up to that Paul David trip one we did on parenting last year. So stay tuned for more information about that. You've generated a ton of thoughts in my own mind tonight, so I'm sure it'll foster some good conversations in my own household as well. But thank you so very much. We do have copies of Dr. McKenzie's book in our bookstore. I heard him say earlier he'd like us to sell lots of those copies, so buy some for your friends. We do have some of the bookstores in there, and sometimes people like the author to sign it. Are you willing to do that? I'm sorry to put you on the spot. Okay, so if you want your book signed, you can ask him. I'm so glad he said yes to that. It would have been super awkward. But let's give him a round of applause, and thank you.